now we want to start our discussion, and I have the micros here. Jean-Robert, you have a question? No.
Yeah, I have responses ready, so I just, like a good politician, I'll listen to the question but give the... No, so I agree with most of what you said. One thing that, for the academic people here, a publication, that's a huge incentive, right? So for us, that's a goal in itself. So for me, if I can choose between publishing in a top journal in economics or being paid money, the amount of money would have to be very high for me to compensate for the two. And so as a company, that's a good way to very often incentivize your consultant if they come from academia, to give them access to data that you could use. And the second, when we talk about data, we try to talk about experimental data. So the data that you described is a data that, many other things have changed in 2015, yes. Right? Yes. And what we try to do is to keep everything equal and have a control group and treatment group and try to do it in this way.
No, that's great, because that's a really scientific approach. Yes. And that gives you the foundation of being right. In the practice, unfortunately, often or almost all the time, we are not in a laboratory situation. Yeah. So the impact of many factors come in that sometimes are unpredictable.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's life. That's what makes life interesting then.
Yes. There's a question over there.
Hey, so I'm the flu shot lady. Actually, I live in Australia, which is why I got the flu shot, because the seasons are different there. So I think probably that's another influence on my motivation to get the flu shot. So I just wanted to ask...
By the way, the flu shot that you get in Australia is completely useless here.
I know, yes. Exactly. Yes. It was only like 2 weeks worth of use that I got, and I thought, will I get flu? But they come to work, so it's easy.
That's what I understood. Never mind.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you've talked a lot about data tonight, and data and in different contexts and incentives that work in different contexts. And I guess I just wanted to ask you a little bit about theory. Because theory is something that has, through the centuries motivated a lot of scientific endeavor. And I know behavioral economics is one of those subfields which I think has maybe not been as prolific in terms of generation of robust theory that holds across multiple contexts as other subfields of economics. And what you see for the field going forward in that area would be really interesting.
So I cannot disagree with you more. I think. So that's good, actually, because if you look at theory, we economists started, or they economists, whoever, started after World War II to define economics, or theory in economics, by a mathematical model. And it's not that before that there were no theories. It's not that psychology doesn't have theory. Cognitive dissonance is a well-defined theory that doesn't speak Greek. There are no Greek letters over there. It's not math, but it's a theory. Right, so the mental accounting is a theory. It doesn't. So, at least in my view, a theory is doesn't have to necessarily be a mathematical model. Right. So that's in that sense I disagree with you, and I think that economics, until World War II, was fine with this approach. Then came Samuelson and others, and I think it was a really major and important contribution to economics, because unlike other fields, we have we need to work with logic. We need to be correct in some terms. But then we fell in love with this kind of approach, and now if it's not a mathematical model with theorems and proofs, it's not theory. So I believe that that's one way of doing theory and another. And clearly there are behavioral economists that are doing so. Benabu and Tirol and Matthew Rabin and many others that are writing mathematical models based on the findings from psychology and behavioral economics. So there is an effort also going in this direction, which I think is not represented here, because I think that for you it would be harder to relate to a mathematical model.
Well, maybe not that much in banking, because if you look at our risk models, they are highly sophisticated and related to mathematics, but in principle I agree, yeah.
For behavioral economics, I guess there must be a lot of cultural differences. If you run experiments in Asia or in the US or in Europe, and coming back to theories, that means you have to adjust each experiment on the culture where you do it, or how does it work? Right. The example you gave with the Shanghai students and the US students.
Right, exactly. So that's a great example where clearly culture is important, and When I do work on gender, I look at different societies and look at the difference. I think that there are some things that are really fundamental. The psychology of mental accounting, for example, I think that works also for the tribes that I studied in India or in Kenya, right? And some things are culturally dependent, right? So not all incentives that work in Austria will work in the US and will work in Japan, for example, right? So maybe in Japan, I'm using stereotypes, I don't really know, maybe more group incentives would work better than they do in the US, right? So clearly you have to adjust. And so some of the basic psychology is there. So, you know, I think that loss aversion is there for everyone, for example. That's my impression from the literature. I think that mental accounting is there, but what goes into the mental account may be culturally dependent. So.
If I made a practical thing here, I've been working in several and different cultures, from the US to Asia. There are some basics that human beings unite. And they are very fundamental, and there is no difference whether you're talking to somebody from Japan or from the US. Human basics are the same everywhere. There's nuances and differences in approaches, but fortunately we are human beings, and this culture and color and whatever does not make a difference.
And culture, by the way, is not just between India and Austria. It's also between, you said that you were in the banking industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, and the custom officer.
Yes.
Those are very different cultures in themselves, right?
Yes.
So.
I have a question regarding these effects you mentioned, like mental accounting or loss aversion. Are there any studies how these effects interrelate to each other? And is there a kind of, let's say, rating? Is some of these effects stronger than others? Or because I assume you can't, even in the experiments, they are not be observed so distinct, right, as a singular point?
I think that in general, the tool that we have, experiments, are really problematic in coming up with values, partly because of cultural reasons, partly because of many other aspects. I think that the experiments are really good at saying if you use the mental accounting, if you use gas cards, it's going to be more effective than if you give discount. We call it a treatment effect, right? So that one we are very good. By how much, and to really trust that this gap will translate into a different environment, that's a very risky thing to do. I think that a good day that I hope that we'll get to in not that many years would be something like what we did with the PISA that I started with, in which we don't study the incentives. We have only one type of incentives, but we put in, like you said, a combination of loss aversion, in this case, paying them immediately. You know, so you come up with things that work, so mental accounting, loss aversion that work, and you try to put them all to work when you try to change behavior. So I can't tell you, the real answer is that I can't tell you if loss aversion is more effective than mental accounting. My guess is that in some cases it would be, in other cases it won't be. But if you can design your incentive such that it will include all of it, without upsetting the target people, I think that should be the goal. So, I don't know.
I have a question. When you make these,
where is it coming from? Over there.
I have
Okay,
a
yes,
question.
sorry.
When you make these policy recommendations, how much? So I want to imagine that how much is worth paying for these sedentary taxi drivers in Singapore that is, in some is less or not more than, so the healthcare costs, you know, because if you save one taxi driver 5,000 euros, that's nothing.
No, that's a great question, right?
And what's the
It's
idea
very easy
behind
to
this?
make taxi driver walk 20,000 steps a day, right? Pay them $1 million a month and they'll do that, right? So the question becomes a question of cost benefit, right? And that's your question. I said that for us it was very easy because the company defined to us what they want and how much they're willing to pay, but So we did find health benefits of doing this, and we are looking at traffic. So whether they disappear from work more or less days, whether they are more involved in car accidents or not, that I don't know. I know that there is some health benefits that we already found, but from our perspective, the company told us we want them to walk more. That's the budget. You can do it. In order to actually have it scalable and last for a long time, you really need to see that the benefit of it is larger than the $100 in this case. And I think that that's a challenge that we have with any incentive scheme that we put in place.
Was it more clear when you did the Medicare or the Medicare?
Over there it didn't work, so it was clear that it was wasted money, right? So that's easy, but I think that in many cases, if you can get your taxi drivers to walk 40% more, I think that the ROI to the company, the return on investment, would be positive if the cost is $100. In particular, when you create the habit formation, so it goes further. But it's always a challenge because we can. So if I can execute you, if you want meet the target, it's going to work, but it's not scalable. After I'll kill the first one, they'll put me in jail, so I won't be able to completely. Right? So yeah.
Okay. The cases you described were all, you have a problem and then you try to design incentives to improve behavior, to have a better result. In real life, you also have sometimes positive trends. Things are getting better. I mean, fewer traffic casualties, more healthy lifestyle. Is it possible to find out what could have been the incentives that change people's behavior and then to draw some significant and useful conclusions?
Right, so you mentioned traffic, and traffic is something that I'm really interested in. How do you reduce accidents, right? And if you look at the literature, you'll see that about 1 in 4 accidents today are caused because of cell phones, because people using cell phones. The question is, how can you change it, right? How can you reduce it? So it's can you look at people that were successful in this and see what's the difference between them and others? And one thing that I really believe that works is a decision not to decide, a decision that I'm just not going to touch the phone. Because if the decision is like for many of us, now I'm going to be 5 minutes late to my son, so I'll just text him for a second. And now the road is clear, I'm just going to, it's going to end up really badly. One of the issues, one of the problems with this is that the feedback is very, very noisy. You do it once, your chance, your chance of being involved in an accident is 10 times larger, but it's still very small. So you do it once, twice, 3 times, the feedback that you get, nothing happens. So I wrote 2 words, now I can write 5 words. And if you do it for 5 years, you're going to have an accident, right? But the problem is that the feedback that you get in the middle is really bad in the sense that nothing happens. So trying to design a situation. So one way that we have in our family is my 14-year-old, if he sees me touching the phone in the middle, he would tell me. If he's in the car, he would tell me that, you shouldn't do this. Even worse, he'll go and tell it to my wife that, daddy used the phone, right? But what I really try to do is to have a policy in which I just don't touch the phone when I drive. So no, I don't even start this negotiation. Right, so I think that's easier, and that's true also for many other things that you can have in traffic. So I'm not going to change lane when to drive between lanes. I'm from Israel, and we often do this, and so try to have this kind of decisions, deciding not to decide in a sense in advance. And I think that that's an example of something that you can observe other people and maybe find out strategies that work.
I think
my question is, you were mentioning before big data and the differences between behavioral economics. How do those two things work together? Because especially in marketing, there are now so many software companies, for instance, who are offering artificial intelligence to really, optimize incentives, for instance. Do you do the experiments beforehand to then go into the data, or how do these things work together?
If you're looking at the company size, then all starts with, we have a problem somewhere, yeah? So, and then you have this big cemetery of data, and if you don't resolve this, then you go to a consultant and ask, help us with that. So normally, Unless you have, in your case, you could have some CRM software that is helping you screening through and make some behavioral assumptions. Nowadays, it just crosses my mind because we recently looked into this also. Some algorithms now are in being developed that you could run across all your data, and that should then get you some conclusions how people react. However, I'm cautious whether we are already there and whether there are not other means that we should start first. And this then starts with some testing some smaller approaches to make sure things work rather than investing millions potentially into some software that is not yet really to the point that you would expect it.
So something that I'm not good at, but many people, many of our friends are, right, with the econometric sense, to go into data, but not just look for, don't just have data mining, but start with the hypothesis that is based on something that makes sense, and then look for it in the data. I think that's a much, not instead, that's in addition, that's a very useful approach in which you start with some kind of hypothesis. Because otherwise you really don't know whether it's just false positive and things like that. So,
my question is to Professor Gneezy. Here.
It comes from here, I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's actually, maybe I should speak. Maybe you can share a bit from your experience with working in different domains which have relatively little in common. How many iterations of and how many different versions do you usually try, and how long does it usually take for you to build, for instance, an incentive model? Let's say, for instance, in the banking industry, you were asked to build me incentive models which we can try out with different groups. Now we segregate different groups and we try different incentive models. One select existing commission models, and let's select a different commission model, and so on and so on.
So, are you in academia or in the real world?
I'm more in the real world, I would say. Yeah.
So in the real world, because for academic, especially if you're a graduate student, some people here are a graduate student, I come here and tell nice stories. I don't tell about all these cases that I started working with the company and invested 2 years of talking once a week with them, and then at the end, the guy that we worked with went away and, everything collapsed, right? And so for graduate student, it's a very risky job to go into into companies. So now I think that I understand where you're coming from. I think that, like I said, these kind of studies are always a learning process, right? Because there are some principles that you can come with, the fungibility, the loss aversion, regret. There are many of these, but then you have to adjust them to your specific environment, right? So it's not that there is one thing that I can tell you how loss aversion will work, because if you don't understand what you're doing, you create what happened with Wells Fargo, for example. Right, so Wells Fargo had to fire more than 5,000 people that cheated. Right, now it's clearly not their fault. The person that designed the incentives should go home. They should also go home, but the guy that should go to jail is the person who designed the incentive scheme that made them cheat. Right, open up all these false, fake accounts. So the point is that you really need to understand the strategic environment in which you are operating to see. If there is any strategic flaw, like in the Wells Fargo case, people will find it. So you need to make sure that what you're doing is not like that. And it's a learning process in which the good companies never stop, right? So the good companies don't say, okay, we run this experiment and now we know. The good company, so a good company to me is a company that tries at the beginning, finds what works best, and then does 80% of its work based on this, and the other 20% keeps experimenting to find something, because maybe you didn't find the best. Second, the environment changes. The stock market goes up, goes down. There is Trump comes up, whatever the political situation, earthquake in whatever, and you need to keep learning as an organization. You need to keep learning. That's the more interesting part. Now, a good consultant, consultant wants to get more money would say, oh, I need to stay with you forever. The good way of doing it is to create this kind of learning mechanism within the organization, because if you come from the outside, you'll never understand it like the people from the inside. So you need to bring your tools to work with them, and then they can keep learning forever.
Thank you.
So coming back to this situation, when you stated that for each non-answered question you take $1 away, yeah, 25 yes. questions, $25. If you would start from the opposite side, you say, okay, you start with the 0, and for each answered question you get $1. Right. Do you think that would change much the behavior?
So that's an example where we try to use the knowledge that we have. So we don't, subjects are scarce. Right, so if we try to, on top of no incentives and incentives, we'll also try manipulate the incentives. We are not going to have power to test our hypothesis. So we need to come up with one incentive scheme. And when you do this, that goes back to your question, I think. We try to put everything that we know that works, and that's why we did the loss aversion, basically 25. So if I give you 25 and now I'm taking money from you, we know that it's more painful to you than if I tell you, okay, I'll give you $1 for every correct answer. So we try to use it. My guess is that yes, it's going to be more effective. I didn't study it in this specific environment, right? Because the point is that at some point we want to have a stock of knowledge that loss aversion, that mental accounting, fungibility work. And now when we design incentives, we simply want to use them. We don't want to test them every time. Again, if we had infinite resources, it would have been the right approach to do. But if you don't, you try to put everything that you can in order to get it to work. So.
My question also concerns big data, and I must warn you that it might come across as a bit provocative, but yeah. It's, well, lately everybody's been talking about big data, and a couple of months ago I read a great article on the topic, and it said it said stuff like there are companies who collect data on everything possible, and it's already for them possible to analyze a person or a personality based on only Facebook likes or something like that, and based on those likes they can actually tell what the race person is or the gender, political preferences, and so on. So and it may look high tech now, all those algorithms and models and so on, but it's really rudimental now. So it is possible, or it's going to happen in the future, that big data is going to become so huge and so important for our everyday lives, and the science or the scientific part of it is going to evaporate. Do you think that there's a possibility that behavioral economics as a science is going to become irrelevant, or is it going to develop together with the big data companies?
So irrelevant, I don't think that it will come simply because it's, there are more and more interesting questions, at least to me. So within my lifetime, I want to live some more years, and I don't think that it's going to become irrelevant. Here's one example. So you're the head of HR at the bank, right? My experience with HR in many places is that they use big data towards the consumers. So they try to build algorithms to understand how the consumers, and they compensate the workers the same way workers were compensated 20 years ago. So we worked with a call center in a big company, for example, in which they try to do everything to understand the consumers, but then instead of using very simple gamification kind of things. So for me, I walk much more since I found out this Pacer app that measures how many steps I walk. And I walk more because of that, and if I forget the phone at home, I will not walk because it's a waste of walking, right? And you can use this kind of things to motivate your workers also. So to use this kind of data that you have, that, like you said, they collect infinite amounts of data and they don't know what to do with it, right? If you can design incentives that will use this data not just towards the customers but also towards your workers, I think that could be a big.
The way is going there, definitely. So I would say banking is not the most advanced industry in that sense, but I know about companies that are, of course, using a lot of data about their employees, the classical ones that the Googles. They are Also, ABM has a big project running where they screen all the emails, all the communication that is going across the organization. And by this, they say, okay, we don't need any surveys anymore. That was done in the past very often, because anyway, out of the communications that people have amongst each other, we know what's the topic, what's the issues, what's it's going on in the minds of our employees. So there is more to come here. But on the other hand, I also wouldn't be afraid, because ultimately you are still a human being. Yeah? And your personal emotions never will be able to be copied or identified or be measured immediately by any algorithm. So when it comes to the human being, then it always will remain the human being, and not the algorithm or the sum of some hypothesis that the computer is making. Yeah, you might be analyzed, but ultimately it remains you. Don't be worried about, so to say, you and your personality.
But I don't think we're that unique as human beings, because we haven't just been born out of nothing. We have like millions of generations before us, and we're actually a product of everything that's been. So we're not that special. And I mean, many behaviors are actually culturally or regionally based or affected. And I mean, every now and then you hear the questions, am I the only one who does that and that? And I mean, you're not the only one, everybody does that. So
this is not what I said. Yeah?
Even the most intimate emotions or affections, I don't know, can actually be predicted if the models are good enough.
So maybe you're asking the wrong people, because we're too old, right? So you look at the one-year-old that looks at the magazine and try to enlarge the picture, yes. Right? That we were not born into this era, right? So it's so it could be that, and so people that walk around and take selfies. So today when I flew in, there was a guy that, seriously, it's an hour-and-a-half flight. I flew through Frankfurt. He filmed the entire flight. It was basically clouds, right? Videotaped the entire. I don't understand it. I don't understand selfies. I don't understand many of the things that happen. So maybe your generation will be more, the emotions will be more obvious to figure out from big data. I think that for me it's going to be still hard to find out what my emotion from the big data.
Can we leave the last question to the upper row? Okay. Because
thank you very much.
No, please leave here. Thank you for your wonderful and inspiring words. Ich bin noch nicht fertig. Thank you for your wonderful and inspiring words. And there are 3 things which I still want to mention. First, thank you for coming and for your participation. Second, I have a little task for you, therefore I need something. Please, those who still, please sign up in our meetup, because then you get all the information and we have your registration. In order to have all the information you need for that, I leave cards here that you can sign up. And then there is a third thing. It's the next event on the 16th of May, which I want to announce. It's with Jim Alm from the University of Michigan. It's with Erich Kirchler from the University of Vienna. It's with experts from the Ministry of Finance. And we talk about how to improve tax compliance. And then there is the last thing. Please don't forget, a change in behavior can change the world.